the stereotypes and how the stereotypes that are manifested can be offensive because it denies individuality. It denies the individual. It denies that you are you who have these other characteristics. You're not allowed to have them. And of course, it then becomes a question of how these stereotypes are appropriated. And this is this concept of cultural appropriation. And it's something we see very strongly in European culture, particularly with issues around Karl May and Winnetou and this whole movement in Central Europe that's still fairly strong, of people playing Indian, that is, spending the weekend living as they imagined Indians lived. So going off and living in a teepee and making fire and doing these kinds of primitive, savage things. One of the issues is that Western culture has this very clear distinction between secular and the sacred. That is the world of this world and what's spiritual. In native cultures, those are not possible to separate. And so, for example, a feather headdress, the classic kind of image, is something that is a sign within native cultures, within some native cultures, because many native cultures don't use feather headdresses, don't have them, never had them, never used them, completely foreign to them. So again, we're talking about this very narrow area on the Great Plains where people were hunting bison. For example, Winnetou would never have worn a headdress. The Apache don't wear headdresses. It's not a part of their culture. It's not a part of their cultural manifestation. So when we see the film and we see Winnetou in a headdress or other Apaches in headdresses, it'd be like if we had a film about Czechs and they were all dressed like Mrázek, like Russians, or like Scandinavians, or like Arabs. So we're going to make a film about Czech culture and we're going to have them dressed up like Arabs, just because. But feather headdresses are not something that you give yourself. They're something that's given to you by the group as a recognition of your status, of achievement, of having accomplished something, of being a high-status individual within that community. Maybe a great hunter, a warrior, a statesman, whatever it might be. A number of different reasons. So they're given, never taken, made for yourself. You would never make one for yourself. They're also never worn by women. It's strictly a male thing. In some cultures, you may have women deciding who gets to wear them, but women would not wear headdresses. So when we see in advertising, we see a woman with feather headdress, that's an offense not only to the culture, but to the spiritual nature of the culture, because it's all entwined. The spiritual and the secular are entwined. It's impossible to separate the two. So this feather headdress is also a sacred object and must thus be treated with the respect that any sacred object would warrant. What we see today in Europe are two images of Native Americans to the exclusion of all others. And there's no middle ground here. There's no, Native Americans being represented in a modern way. Native Americans are only represented in this historicizing, almost ahistorical fashion, as in headdresses and on the plains, in this fixed kind of 19th century vision of them. One of the things that the stereotypes do is they also remove indigenous peoples from history. They become nameless. How many named Indians do people in this part of Europe know? Well, they know the fictional Indians, but, do they know who? They might know Sitting Bull, but do they know Hiawatha? Do they know Tecumseh? Do they know Tenskwatawa? Do they know Chief Joseph? Do they know all these important individuals who impacted the history of the United States and through that the history of Western civilization? So we also need to reintroduce these individuals. And again, that's important, the individual, the named individual. This person lived and died and has a history and an impact. And that's completely missing in European conceptions of Native peoples. Native women have just been elected to Congress. The first two American Indian women have just been elected to Congress. And they're presenting a very different kind of image. It's really interesting. One of them is a former MMA fighter, mixed martial arts, a former MMA fighter who's also a lesbian, And she represents completely different, and so that's really important to see this image, to see this different kind of image, someone else. We see Native peoples reduced to these, stereotypes of the chief, the warrior, the savage. And we see this then spreading into European cultures in places where it has no connection, just as it did in the United States, where it doesn't really have any meaning. So we have ice hockey teams using that imagery across Europe, not just here. Rugby. So there's teams that use this same kind of language and imagery, even though it's not a part of their cultural expression. When the Brno hockey team defeats the Pilsen hockey team, and someone posts a picture on Facebook of the American cavalry defeating the Indians and says, "Konec Indoshu," this is this kind of the disappearing, the end of Indians. Well, he's just reiterating a stereotype that's been around for almost 200 years, the dead Indian. And then on the other hand, Pilsen actively promote the noble savage. So at the beginning of their games, they have people come out in feather headdresses. Well, on what basis is that individual who's Czech wearing a feather headdress, skating around an ice rink in some costume, something that the people here might understand as a comparable violation? It'd be like if a Native American group decided, well, we're going to call ourselves the Popes, and we're going to have a figure in a Pope skating around the ice rink with a crucifix, blessing the crowd, and, throwing communion wafers to the crowd, and then, pouring some holy water over the ice to bless the ice. Would that be really appropriate? We could see it as satire, but because we have such a clear distinction between the sacred and the secular, no, you can't do that. But for Native peoples, because the sacred and secular are so intertwined, almost any use of Native American imagery is going to cause this kind of offense. There are attempts by Native peoples to present these other images, but the question becomes, to what degree do they get consumed by the general population? All that we can do is try to present these other kinds of imageries to educate people about these kinds of things. And so it's partly why I teach what I teach, because I want to present these different images of, so when I teach about Native Americans or African Americans or other groups, part of the point is to present these things that go against stereotypical representations of how people from Africa are perceived or how Native Americans are perceived. And then this can apply to other groups, because we see the same thing in the United States with Asian Americans. All Asian Americans are smart. And of course, that's just as limiting in many respects. And we could talk about, how Jews have been represented in European culture, how Asians are represented, how, all these different groups, they all get these stereotypes and they have real impacts. These impacts, manifest themselves in extreme cases in philosophies like Nazism. Nazism is in part based on a stereotype about how Jews were perceived in Europe, going back to the Middle Ages, that they're money grabbing, that they practice strange rituals, that they do these different kinds of things, that they're a threat to society. Well, that's not, in many respects, not that different than how Native peoples were perceived in the United States, that they perform strange rituals, they're a threat to society, they need to be gotten rid of. So by addressing one set of stereotypes and understanding how stereotypes are formed and the damage they can cause, then this can help us to look at other stereotypes, deconstruct them, and understand how they developed, what they signify, what their meaning is, and how that affects our society.